Hi, everyone, and welcome to the How to Go Organic webinar. I'm your host, Sue Chen, and on behalf of the OOHC, that's the Oregon Organic Hazelnut Collective, which this webinar is hosted by, we wanted to welcome you. So OOHC, we are the only group that is providing education, building community, and creating resources specific to the Oregon organic hazelnut industry. We are a small but mighty group. So the mission of these webinars is to provide you with inspiration, education, and empowerment. And so this is the second webinar in our series. Our first webinar, which was back in February, was Why Go Organic? And in that webinar, we had such an incredible and dynamic panel, and they provided us with so much education and insight and inspiration on why to go organic. And we also had a very dynamic Q&A session. So that webinar is recorded. If you got your quarterly newsletter from OOHC, you'll see a link to that recording. We'll also have that on our website, which is OregonOrganicHazelnuts.org. All right, so to this webinar. So in this webinar series, we're looking about going organic, and we've had the webinar, Why Go Organic, and now How to Go Organic. And so organic hazelnuts are just 1% of the hazelnuts grown in Oregon with organic or sustainable practices. And so we have such an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to improve our crop, to improve our farms, to improve our lives, and to improve the planet. And we're doing that right here, right now, with this webinar series and our collective mission. All right, so before I get started, I wanted to introduce our panel today. So first, Tanya Murray, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I'm Tanya Murray. I work for Oregon Tilth, and if you're not familiar with Oregon Tilth, we are a nonprofit organization focused on organic certification, education, and advocacy work, all to promote organic agriculture. And I am housed in the education program at Oregon Tilth. I do also want to share that I have some firsthand experience with the organic certification process, actually as a grower, not a hazelnut grower, but back in my farming days as a diversified vegetable grower. But I did go through the certification process several years back. So I understand what it's like to be a grower that's embarking on that process. And my goal today is hopefully to make that process just a little less daunting for you and get you some good information to get started. So thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so thrilled to have you on this panel and this session today. All right, and next, Chris Lessy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm a grad student at OSU. I study soil science, and I was lucky enough to get a specialty crop block grant from USDA. And basically what I'm studying is how to overcome the barriers to cover crop usage in hazelnut orchards. And so what I'm doing is a randomized block trial to look at farms with cover crops and without cover crops in similar soil series and comparing the two, collecting data, and then after I compile all of the results, finding some hard data on how cover crops are affecting soil health. I'm really happy to be here today. This is my first time ever being involved with a webinar. I feel like this is a really big opportunity. So thank you, Sue, for inviting me.
Oh, we're so happy.
Yeah, I'm happy to be a part of this.
And giving you a big virtual hug as your first live webinar. I know sometimes this can get nerve-wracking, but we are just a community here, and we've got a lot of support right here on this virtual room and this webinar. All right, well, I'm Sue Chen, and just a little bit of how I got here. And so several years ago, I wanted to have a farm in Oregon. My mom says I was having a midlife crisis, but I say I was having a midlife revelation. So as I came to Oregon and I was scouting for land, I discovered hazelnut orchards. I'm like, wow. And I fell in love with the filbert tree. And so I bought the land, and back in 2016, I planted on 9 acres. And for the first few years, I farmed conventionally, but I started asking questions, because I really loved this property. I loved the land. Not only did I love the trees, but I loved the birds and the bees and the wildlife and the soil and the microorganisms. And plus, I live on this property, so I'm part of the ecosystem too. And we were spraying, massive amounts of herbicides and pesticides to kill the weeds, to have this bare floor, to kill the suckers, to kill the filbert moss. And I started asking, like, it's killing these things, what else is it killing? And what is it doing to me and everyone that's on this property? So 3.5 years ago, I decided to go organic. And I realized there were just so few farmers that were going organic. And not only am I a webinar host, but I'm also a very enthusiastic participant. And I am so looking forward to this information today. All right, so let's get started. So Tanya, I'm going to kind of turn this session over to you first. So let me make you host. And so let's start with getting certified, okay, and the requirements, because I'm going through the process myself, and I know it can be a little bit scary and overwhelming, and it just seems like so much paperwork and so much processes. So can you share what it means to go organic? In other words, what are the requirements? And then share the process for the organic certification. All right, take it away, Tanya.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sue. And thanks again for everyone for being here and for your interest in going organic. I wanted to just share one other background piece, which is that I'm presenting today as part of the Northwest Transition to Organic Partnership Program. And this is a new program that was funded by the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, really to provide education, technical support, and help producers to transition to organic and ultimately to grow the organic sector. At the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing a little bit about a specific mentorship opportunity through this Northwest Transition to Organic Partnership Program. So to get started, how to go organic. Marketing your hazelnuts as organic is really going to come down to 2 things. One is going to be implementing organic production practices according to the USDA organic regulations. And 2 is going to be getting certified before harvest by an accredited third-party organic certifier. So today I'm really going to be talking about the certification requirements and the certification process. And the information that I'm sharing today is relevant regardless of the certifier that you opt to work with. What are the USDA organic regulations? So in 1990, the Organic Foods Production Act established the National Organic Program, and that program created a single set of rules that dictate what qualifies as organic crop production, livestock production, handling and processing in the US, and what agricultural products can legally be sold as organic. I'm going to be giving really an overview of the regulations today. I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details. So it is important that you make yourself familiar with the regulations. And you can find those regulations on the USDA Agricultural Marketing Services website under the organic regulations. And here I would suggest really focusing, because there's a lot of information on subpart C, which is the part specific to organic crop production. The key principles that are really at the core of the organic regulations are summed up by the NOP's definition of organic, which is here, and says organic production is a production system that responds to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of nutrients, promote ecological balance, and conserve biological diversity. And in this definition, you really see the idea reflected that organic is a systems approach. And also you see recognition that organic growers are responding to site-specific conditions. In other words, here, there's really recognition that while the rules are really universal, the way that they're going to be implemented is going to look different for every unique operation. And that'll come up a few times as we talk about the standards. Finally, an important objective of organic agriculture that is expressed here is to cycle resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biological diversity. So based on this definition of organic production, the production standards really focus on maintaining or improving the natural resources of the operation, including the soil and water. And this includes taking care of the conditions of the soil, minimizing erosion, and preventing contamination to crops, soil, and water. So I'm going to next talk about some of the specific requirements that I think are most relevant to organic hazelnut growers. First, let's look at the natural resources and biodiversity conservation requirement. This requirement really reflects that definition that we looked at earlier, and it requires that you implement production practices that are going to maintain or improve the natural resources and biodiversity of the operation, including the soil and water quality. And so here, again, the idea that what this looks like is going to look different for every operation. A few examples of conservation activities that you might implement on your orchard would be alley cropping, intercropping, and hedgerows. And so this might be where cover cropping ties in, which you'll hear more from Chris on later. Monitoring soil moisture, using efficient irrigation techniques, suppressing or removing invasive weed species, or installing raptor perches, bat and bird boxes. So those are just some of the examples of what you could do under this requirement to improve the natural resources and biodiversity of the operation. Next, we'll look at the soil fertility and crop nutrient management practice standard. This one has a lot to it, and I've just tried to really distill this down for you to a simple list of do's and don'ts. So this practice standard really says, do promote, maintain, and improve soil organic matter. Do use cover crops, so there's those cover crops again, and apply plant and animal materials to manage crop nutrients and soil fertility, and do follow specific requirements for managing compost that includes plant and animal materials. And that one comes down to carbon to nitrogen ratios and how you're managing your compost in terms of temperature and turning. There's also some don'ts. So don't cause soil erosion, don't damage the soil health or contaminate crops, soil, or water by the plant nutrients, pathogenic organisms, heavy metals, or residues of prohibited substances. Don't use any synthetic substances unless they're allowed on the national list of allowed and prohibited substances, and don't use any non-synthetic substances that is prohibited on the list. And I'm going to be talking more about that national list later on, so stay tuned for a little more on like, what is this list and where do we find it? Don't incorporate raw manures less than 120 days before harvest, so that timing is really important. I can't see one of mine. Don't use sewage sludge, and don't use burning of crop residues, or use burning as a way to dispose of crop residues. So this is really the practice that pertains to how you're managing soil fertility and crop nutrients. The next practice standard that I wanted to talk about really focuses on how you're managing pests, weeds, and disease, and really requires that you start first with a preventative approach, preventative practices, and then turn to more mechanical and physical controls before you start to use any kind of substances. And so examples of some of the preventative practices, preventative and physical and mechanical and physical controls include things like mowing, mechanical cultivation and livestock grazing, releasing beneficial insects, creating habitat, trap crops, looking at your nutrient and water management, probably there as a way to manage disease, as well as varietal selection and sanitation measures. And for this practice, only after you've really exhausted using preventative practices and mechanical and physical controls, only after that point can you use biological or botanical substances or allowed synthetics that are on the list. And when you do that, you do need to document the conditions that prompted you to using those substances. In terms of seed and planting stock, you are required to use organically grown, untreated, non-GMO seeds, annual seedlings, and planting stock. There is recognition that sometimes those varieties are not, the equivalent organically produced varieties are not going to be available commercially. So if that is the case, you are allowed to use non-organically produced untreated seeds and planting stock, but you do need to do a few things. Mainly, you need to document your attempt to source those organic, say, planting stocks for, in this case, but seeds are important to consider too, because this also applies to cover crop seed, for example. So it's not just your planting stock, but any seeds, any planting stock that you bring onto the orchard. So you need to document your attempt to source organically from at least 3 sources. And there is still restrictions on treated seeds where you can only use untreated varieties or treated seeds when untreated varieties are not commercially available. And again, you need to document that you looked for those, and those treated, the treatments need to be allowed treatments, again, on that national list that I'll come back to. This last piece of the regulation pertains to nursery stock specifically, or planting stock. And it just says that non-organically produced planting stock can be used if there's not an organic equivalent. So like I already said, but you do need to document that. Once that planting stock is back on your orchard after you've purchased it, then any substances that you apply, or if you have it contract grown, in both of those cases, substances then need to be NOP compliant. So good to look at this standard. And finally, the last standard I wanted to talk about is the land requirements. And the land requirements say that any field or farm parcel from which harvested crops are intended to be sold, labeled, or represented as organic have to have been managed in accordance with the regulations. So we just talked about some of those regulations. And they have to have no prohibited substances applied for a period of 3 years immediately preceding harvest of the crop. And so what that means in terms of the timing of getting certified, if you were looking at getting this year's crop certified, assuming an October 1st harvest date or later, that would only be eligible if you hadn't applied any prohibited substance since September 30th of 2020. Looking forward, so we can also look forward here and say, if your last application of a prohibited substance occurred on September 30th of this year, then you would be essentially looking 3 years out to certify your harvest for 2026. So that's how the timing works with that 3-year period. And of course, there's variations in between there, but it's a 3-year period. The other piece here is that the land requirement includes applications of any prohibited substances on your fields via drift from neighbors. And so because of this, you need to be sure that you really have distinct defined boundaries and buffers to prevent contamination in place. And you also need to really document every material or substance that you're bringing into your orchard as part of your application for organic certification. And this is really every material, product, substance, including seeds and planting stock. And you do that kind of documentation during the transition period, but also beyond once you're certified. So the land requirement is an important piece of the process. I've mentioned the national list a few times, and so I wanted to come back to that here. The national list of allowed and prohibited substances. So this is the list that is part of the regulations that identifies the substances that you can use and the substances you can't use for organic crop production. Generally speaking, synthetic substances are prohibited unless they're specifically allowed, and natural or non-synthetic substances are allowed unless they're specifically prohibited. You can find that list in the regulations, but it can get fairly technical. And so a more user-friendly option for checking on the substances that you might be looking at using would be the Organic Material Review Institute's listing. For short, it's called the OMRI list. They have a web-based listing of products and materials allowed for use in organic production. The OMRI list includes both generics and products, if you will, manufactured products. I would say be careful if you're shopping for products, when you see that OMRI label, that you also check the list, because product labels don't get updated as quickly as the list gets updated. And sometimes there will be changes to what is allowed on the list. So it's good to check that OMRI list as a go-to. There's also there's another list called the Organic Input Material List, available from the WSDA, Washington State Department of Agriculture, and California's Department of Food and Agriculture. So those are also just another place to check. And finally, once you're in contact or once you're certified, it's always best practice to check with your certifier on any input before you actually use it. I wanted just to offer a couple more helpful hints along these lines. And one is just to be very mindful about making sure that you confirm the use of really any material or substance at all, and here to think really broadly in terms of the term input. So this isn't just going to be fertilizers or herbicides that you need to consider. It's really going to be any material or substance that you're bringing into your operation. Also, there's going to be some substances that are going to be on the list and allowed under certain conditions. And so you have to really pay attention to that if there's restrictions, even though it's an allowed substance, on how you use it. Finally, some substances, are allowed, but you have to document the need for that use, for example, by doing tissue testing. Some specific examples of some substances that maybe might not come to mind immediately. Latex paint is not allowed unless so this is kind of that conditional use, being allowed specifically as a graft sealant. Lumber is something that is not allowed if it's treated with arsenate or other prohibited materials. For new installations or for replacement purposes when there's contact with soil or with livestock. Be careful of using rhizobia inoculants. Just check on those because they can be genetically modified, so that would make them prohibited. So important there to check the OMRI list on products. Micronutrients are an example of a substance that can require documentation of a deficiency through testing to be able to use them. And finally, some pheromone products can include ingredients in the product that are prohibited, which would make them not allowed. So again, just making sure to check that OMRI list when you're using something before you apply it, to make sure that you'll be eligible for certification and remain so. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of just some of the basics of what it means to be in compliance with the regulation organically. And now I just wanted to cover a little bit about the certification process before I hand it over to Chris. The first thing you'll need to do when you're starting to think about getting certified is to find a certifier. And the Agricultural Marketing Services website also has a organic certifier locator list, so you can search for a certifier. There are over 40 certifiers on that list with headquarters in the US. And there are 2 in Oregon, the Oregon Department of Agriculture and Oregon Tilth, 1 in Washington, the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And it can be more economical to work with a certifier that's closer to where you're located, really depending on where the certifier's inspectors are. And so that's just a reason to think about location for the certifier. The next thing you're going to want to do is to complete your organic systems plan, or your OSP. The OSP is really a critical part of your application. And it's also important to complete it early, because your organic systems plan is really going to help you, developing that organic systems plan is really going to help you actually to start implementing your organic production practices. So it asks you some really good questions to help you start to think about what that plan is going to look like. You can find examples of OSPs on certifiers' websites just to give you an idea of what's in those OSPs. Do plan to submit your application for certification well in advance of when you want to get certified, when you want that certificate in hand, which does need to be before harvest. So just as an example, for Oregon Tilth right now, we currently need to receive an application at least 3 months prior to when you would want your certificate in hand. And that timeline for us can change, can be different for every certifier. So it's really important that you just stay in communication with your certifier through the transition period on that timing. Different certifiers are also going to have different fees and fee structures. So that's another thing to really start to look at who you want to certify with, and then learn about what those different fees look like from each certifier. There is a cost share program available through the National Organic Program, which covers 75% of certification fees up to $750. That's been an annual program that's been around for quite a while, and we expect to be available going forward. So once you've submitted your application and your certifier gets it, they may get back to you and ask you for some additional information. Responding to that in a prompt manner will help your application move faster through the process. Once the certifier has all the information they need, they will schedule an inspection. An inspector will come out and will be basically verifying that what you said you do in your OSP is what you are doing. And they'll be verifying that through a combination of observation and also wanting to look at your records. And so you will want to develop, as part of your OSP, record keeping systems to document what you do, what you say you're doing in your OSP. And those also can be farm unique to your operation. They just have to communicate the information that you need to demonstrate you're doing what you said. Your inspector will write a report on what they see when they're out at your orchard, and that report will be reviewed by the certifier that you're working with, and then they'll make their certification decision. That decision could be an automatic certification. Sometimes you'll get what's called a non-compliance, or maybe more than one, and non-compliances are essentially areas where you need to change something in order to be compliant and to then get certified. So that's really how the process works. At the end of the process, you receive your organic certification and you can market your crops organically. There is an annual renewal process. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that is an annual process. I wanted to just wrap up by sharing a couple of resources for going organic. I mentioned already through the Transition to Organic Partnership Program that there is a farmer-to-farmer mentorship program. You can find some more information about that on the Tilth website. The idea there is to link growers who are transitioning to organic with growers that are experienced with organic production and facilitate some peer-to-peer learning. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, also has a lot of great programs to support growers with implementing conservation practices. And there is those programs can provide financial support for implementing things like cover cropping, planting hedgerows, installing more efficient irrigation systems. There's a new organic management practice standard under an initiative called the Transition to Organic Initiative. And that standard is one that, well, all these practices are ones that you can reach out to your local NRCS agent about. That particular standard has a deadline that's coming right up, which is June 15th for funds for this year. So if that's something you're interested in, I would reach out very immediately to your NRCS agent. There will be more funding for that program in next year and in future years. And when you reach out to NRCS, let them know that you're transitioning to organic and that you're interested in the new initiatives to support you. That might help steer you to the right programming and support that they have. And finally, to wrap up, I just will mention that I've been working with the collective, the Oregon Organic Hazelnut Collective, on a project to develop a cost analysis tool specifically for organic hazelnut production to help growers evaluate their own costs of production. And I'll be sharing more about that tool and releasing it in a sort of beta form for some more growers to try out at the summer meeting. So you can hear more about that then. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand it back to you, Sue, and we'll do some questions at the end.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Tanya. That's such great information. And something that I wanted to share as a huge takeaway was the broad definition of inputs. And let's see. And just to make sure you double check, because you don't want to derail your 3-year process by putting in something that is going to completely void this 3 years of hard work that you put in. Thank you so much, Tanya. So next, Chris, I'm going to make you host here. And as we heard from Tanya, cover cropping is integral in our organic production system. And we are so excited to learn more.
Yeah, I'm excited to kind of get into the nitty gritty of cover crops. So I'm just gonna start my slideshow. All right, okay, I think it's all loaded and I think it's ready to go. So I'll do another quick introduction. My name is Chris Lessie. I'm a grad student at OSU studying soil science. And my project is looking at using cover crops in hazelnut orchards and comparing those to traditional hazelnut orchards that do not have cover crops and looking at how that affects soil health. Sorry, having a little technical difficulty on going forward with my slides. Here we go.
There you go.
There we go. So as Sue mentioned earlier, 99% of hazelnuts are grown conventionally. So when you're driving down I-5 or down Highway 99 and you see these hazelnut orchards, oftentimes you're going to see what we call the bowling alley, which is just bare soil. And what these farmers do is multiple times a year, they'll go through with machines and and basically just eliminate any bumps. They'll use some pretty intense herbicides. A lot of times they'll use what are called pre-emergent herbicides. So they'll spray these in the winter before anything germinates, and then essentially nothing will grow in these orchards except the hazelnuts. And that's been the industry standard here in Oregon for this crop. And part of the reason that farmers have chosen to go this route is because of the harvesting tools they use. So with hazelnuts, they wait till the nuts fall, and then they use sweepers to make what's called a windrow. And then from there, they are swept onto a conveyor belt. And when you don't have a cover crop, when you have bare soil, this can be a very efficient method if the weather works in your favor. So one of the big drawbacks of having a bare orchard is trafficability. So if you do get rain during the harvest season, a lot of times farmers will basically give up on the harvest rather than put tracks through their field with their equipment. And also the hazelnuts kind of get caked in mud, which increases their cost to clean the hazelnuts when they go to sell them. And some of the drawbacks to having bare soil from a soil health perspective is you're going to have higher rates of erosion. That water is not going to be able to infiltrate into that dry, compacted soil. You can get compaction. A big source of compaction, especially in an area like the Willamette Valley that gets 40 plus inches of rain, is actually rainfall. So a good way to think about rain on bare soil is like these little bombs that are falling on the soil. And it actually, because water is actually pretty heavy and it can actually compress the soil. And when that happens, then that leads to slow infiltration rate. So infiltration rate is the time it takes for water to soak into the soil. And compaction, erosion, and infiltration rate are all interconnected. So the more compaction you have, the slower your infiltration rate, and then the higher your rate of erosion. And when you have bare soil, another issue is the temperature of the soil. So there's over 1 billion microbes in 1 teaspoon of soil. And those microbes, they need to have an equilibrium of temperature for them to function. And when you have bare soil, there's a huge flux, so basically a change in the temperature of the soil between the afternoon and the early morning. So in the afternoon, the soil is very warm. It can be over 100 degrees. And at night, then it can swing and get very cold. And what this does is it limits the amount of microbes that can survive in those large temperature swings. Another issue with the bare soil is dust. So anytime you drive equipment on bare soil, you're going to be kicking up a lot of dust. And again, that's just lost soil. You're basically losing some of your valuable resources. So this is what some of the testing that I do. In the top picture, we call this an infiltration ring. So this is a pipe that I put into the ground, and I put a set amount of water. So I put 1 inch of water, and then I time how long it takes for that water to soak into the soil. And that is what we call the infiltration rate. In the lower picture, it shows some of the tools I use. Not great, not super easy to see, but I use a shovel. So I dig a small hole, and then I take soil samples from that. I do that instead of using a soil probe, because this keeps the soil structure intact. And this is when I'm taking soil temperature measurements. So cover crops in orchards come in all different flavors. So on the top picture is what I like to refer to as the golf course method. So a lot of farmers really like to have neat, orderly orchards, and growing grass down the alleyways is a good way for them to get a lot of the benefits of cover crops and also maintain the look and structure of the orchard that they like. And generally, in these systems, you use a perennial crop and you mow it throughout the season, just like you would grass or at a golf course. And then the lower portion is an annual cover crop. So this is crimson clover. So this is a cover crop that you let grow to maturity, and then you mow it, and that terminates it. And so it basically turns into a layer of green mulch. And so it's kind of one and done, and then that'll break down into the soil. So it's really just going to come down to what's going to work best for your farm and your soil. And again, this picture touches on that. So the top picture is a picture of an annual mix. So there's clovers and grasses all mixed together. And then this would be the type of cover crop where you do one big push to terminate it, and then it's going to leave a thick mulch layer. And the lower level is, again, a different farm that was using grass. They were doing a little different, though. They were letting it get tall, and then they were baling it into hay bales, which is using as an intercrop, which I thought was an interesting way, another way to make money off of the orchard. So instead of, these guys are only going to mow once or twice, whereas in the earlier picture, they were mowing 4 or 5 times a season. So in this top picture, this is from the orchard that I refer to as the golf course orchard. This is really high maintenance. They say they mow their orchard 5 times a season, whereas the lower orchard, they're only going to mow it once. So it comes down to how much resources you can put towards managing your orchard. And it's going to be personal preference and your soil series and what's going to work best for your equipment. The moral of this study is any type of cover cropping system you choose is likely going to be better than having no cover crop at all. There's no right or wrong answer on what cover crop is going to work or which is the best. My biggest recommendation would be anyone who's interested would be to try test plots. So try growing different cover crops in different sections, and just to see what it's like, how it grows in your soil and how you are able to harvest off of the cover crop, because it will affect how you harvest. It'll have a lot of different effects. And this is kind of a good way to figure out what's going to work without taking a huge gamble on using one specific cover crop method in your orchard. This is my first year on my project, so I'm in the middle of taking samples and collecting data. I haven't compiled it all together yet, but one of my biggest takeaways from comparing the data of orchards with cover crops to orchards without cover crops would be the infiltration rate of water and the soil temperature. So orchards with cover crops, generally the infiltration rate of 1 inch of water is in between 15 seconds and 45 seconds. Whereas in a traditional orchard with bare soil, it's averaging 2 minutes to 6 minutes. So that's a pretty profound difference on how quickly the water can come into your soil. And this really comes into play when we have these large kind of erratic rainstorms that we get here in Oregon, where you can get an inch of water in less than an hour. And when your soil has cover crops, it's primed, it's ready to go. The root architecture of the cover crop basically makes these channels that the water can flow down into your water table, and that's going to reduce erosion. And then the other big takeaway I had with the cover crops was temperature. I was averaging 20 degrees cooler in areas with cover crops compared to areas without cover crops. And from there, you're going to have higher biodiversity in your soil and happier microbes, and that's going to lead to happy plants. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Sue. Thank you so much for letting me do a quick presentation.
Thank you so much, Chris. That is such exciting information about what cover crops can do. And like you said, it's kind of like, it doesn't really matter. There's so many different options, but just having that soiled cover like a living mulch makes such a big difference in the nutrients of the soil, leading to the health of the trees, but also with water. And I was just sharing with this panel when we were getting started, that, we haven't had rain, in almost a month, in Oregon, but my orchard floor doesn't feel like it, because it's completely covered in cover crop, which is keeping the soil more moist, and the trees seem much happier. They don't look like they're as thirsty as they should be. So that's just so interesting. All right, well, we have a few minutes for some Q&A. And so go ahead and submit your questions, guys, in here, and I'll go ahead and read it here. So first question is from Bradley. How old should a conventional orchard be before conversion? Is there such a thing as too soon? I've heard some say leave 7 to ensure an orchard is well established before conversion. Any thoughts on that?
My initial thought is generally you're not going to get much of a harvest from hazelnuts in the first 5 years. So that during those initial years, you could save money on the cost of certification by not certifying. I would recommend still following the NOP and documenting so that when you do submit your paperwork, all your ducks are in a row and you can get certified. But that would be my quick takeaway, would be a way for a producer to save a little bit of money as your orchard is establishing.
Tanya, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't know.
For me, I farmed conventionally the first 3 years, and then have been going organic the last 3.5, 4. But we have people in the OHC that started organic from planting, and so I think it just kind of varies. But our group is a good resource. And then just to answer another question about the summer tour would be a great place where there are more farmers that are organic in transition in different phases of it, coming together as a great networking and resource event. And that summer tour is August 25th. So I get to answer that question as well, Bradley and Christina. And then Christina had a question here. Is there a good cover crop to increase and aid in calcium uptake and boron uptake?
Oh, that's a good question. When Tanya was talking about micronutrients, my initial thought was boron. So here in the Willamette Valley, we have a lot of our soils are Missoula flood deposits, and they're classically deficient in boron. So that's a really key nutrient for bud set on a lot of orchard crops. And yeah, so the thing about nutrients like that is you can't really grow a cover crop that's going to increase that. The cover crops are only able to uptake what is in the soil. So if your soil is deficient in boron, there isn't a way to increase that without artificially adding that, either in a foliar spray or some type of soil application. Calcium, I don't have a good question I don't have a good recommendation off the top of my head, but I'm definitely going to look into that.
And what we do with these questions, if we can't answer them, is we log them, and we have a database of them so that we can explore those questions on future Q&As. We're looking at doing an FAQ with gathered questions, so we have time to actually go out to experts and get research. So keep asking the questions, and we will get answers for you. All right.
And so I'm not a cover crop expert, but I will say that not calcium or boron specifically, but there are nitrogen fixing. There are cover crops that will add nitrogen fixation to your soil through relationships with the mycorrhizae, and so that's a place where you could actually get some additional nutrients and offset some of your input costs, essentially, and what you're bringing into the operation. It's not my expertise area in an orchard system, but I think there could be some opportunity there.
Great.
Yeah, I'd love to segue off that for really quick. That's a really fascinating process. It's called nitrogen fixation, and Tanya touched on it with her presentation about Rhizobia inoculans. So all the plants in the legume family, so this would be clover, beans, alfalfa, um, they make a symbiotic relationship with a species of bacteria called Rhizobia that attaches to the root, and it's able to take atmospheric N2 gas and split it into NO3 minus and NH3 plus, which is nitrogen fertilizer for plants. It's this really interesting symbiotic relationship, and that's a big part of my study, is figuring out how using legumes in these orchards could help reduce input costs for farmers. And this is the best way to get nitrogen into your soil, in my opinion, because it's a slow release of nitrogen from the legumes. Whereas when you use synthetic nitrogen or even feather meal, it's kind of like a big flush of nitrogen all at once. And the reason we have issues with nitrogen contaminating water is because it's negatively charged, and so is the soil, and so they repel each other, and so nitrogen can flow through your soil profile quite quickly. And so it's best to kind of do like a trickle feed of nitrogen to the plants to mitigate that.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We had a question here from Tracy. This is a really good one. I know it was on my mind when I started having cover crops grown. Does mowing cover crop allow for successful sweeper harvest? And that's such a good question, because when I asked the question, I was like, so why do we have to have, a completely bare floor? And the answer was so we can have, a great harvest and the highest yield, and we don't want to lose a single nut on the orchard floor. And I was like, oh, okay. So then when you have cover crop, you're going to lose some nuts to the harvester. And so this is a great topic that we'll be addressing in the next webinar. But also last year in my harvest, we had a full cover crop floor that we mowed as low as we could and flailed before harvest. And we probably lost about 10 to 12, 15% of the nuts that were still on the floor. And we were able to still collect most of the nuts, and they were cleaner. There was much less dust and disruption. I saw harvesting happening just a few acres away, and it was just a complete dust storm. And at my farm, there was hardly any dust at all. And I was concerned about the nuts, maybe having more food sources, so more squirrels and rodents and gophers and moles and voles, and there wasn't more population of the rodents than I had seen in previous years. But we'll be addressing the harvesting and this in the summer webinar. I wanted to see if you guys, let me see if there's other questions here. Hold on. Okay. Have you used mycorrhizal fungi with hazelnuts? Sorry, I butchered that.
That's a great question. I actually wrote a grant earlier this year that I submitted to the Hazelnut Commission to study ectomycorrhizae interactions with hazelnuts. So if I get the grant, I'll be taking a sample of hazelnut roots, and then I'll be extracting the DNA so ecto means on the outside. So those are the mycorrhizae that are attaching to the outside of the roots. And so if I get the grant, I'll be extracting that mycorrhizae and then sequencing the DNA to figure out which species are actually connecting to their roots. And we call that associations. So I would love to study that. I don't have any data on that, but it's something that's very fascinating to me.
Yet. So stay tuned, Tracy. We may get some answers to that if Chris can get that grant. All right, Tanya, I've got a question for you. Are there any concerns for an operation that wants to attempt up pick for hazelnuts? You pick for hazelnuts. Would there be specific instructions for customers coming into that orchard to prevent contaminants?
There is nothing that I'm aware of in the regulations, but I might throw this to my colleague Marina that's here as well. I think there's also a layer on this that might be a food safety question. And so that at some point, might be something to check in terms of food safety regulations. But I will ask Marina here to jump on, and if you have a different answer.
No, that's my answer as well. I'm Marina.
Yeah.
I work with Oregon Tilth as well with Tanya, but yeah, nothing specific in the regulation that would really warrant any specific precautions for U-pick. A lot of organic producers use U-pick as a strategy.
All right.
Thanks, Marina.
Hi, Marina. Thank you. All right, so we are coming towards the end of this session on how to go organic. That was such great information, Tanya and Chris. We will be following up with all the participants on the session with the recording and the information that Tanya provided. And then you'll also get information on, if you don't already have our newsletter, to sign up for our newsletter, and information about our summer tour, which is on August the 25th. All right, that was just so much fun. I learned so much myself. I can't wait to watch the recording, because I didn't get a chance to take notes, but I will be on that recording. And so this is just so exciting, because this is how things start. When we look at the vineyards around the valley, we see cover crop on most of the vineyards. It seems normal. And, right now, normal is just really kind of this bare brown orchard floor with some trees on there. And I think that one day maybe the normal is to see these beautiful orchards with cover crops, and that they're thriving with life. So excited to see what our new normal might be. All right. Thank you, everyone, for this great webinar. Thanks for attending today. And we'll see you guys on the next one.
Thank you.
Everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.